Good morning, everybody. It's actually part of my brief today is not only to talk about some of the ideas that I have explored over the last 20, 30 years, but also to talk about the work of Jim Cummins and what a pleasure it is to be here and what an honor it is to actually serve to open this amazing conference. And I think it's a tribute to you, Jim, that you have so many people who are interested in your work and also prepared to do the hard work of organizing a conference. And many of us who've come out from UBC and other parts of the world are very privileged to be part of this conversation. So what I'm going to talk about in the presentation is to begin with the big picture, looking at Jim's work in relation to the larger social world. And then I'm going to enter into a conversation with Jim on a project that is bringing great excitement to my life at present, and what I'm sure will involve me for many years in the future, called the African Storybook Project. And what you will see, Jim, is how influential your work has been in that context. It certainly has been important in many contexts. Everywhere I go, in fact, I was just at a school in Vancouver just a couple of weeks ago, and the teacher there was talking about Bix and kelp. And I wanted to say, I know, Jim, I know. So, but in any event, in the African context, your work has been profound. So we're going to talk a little bit about ways in which the interdependence hypothesis, literacy engagement, powers collaborative, Bix and kelp, and identity texts intersect with my work in that context. And then we're going to move towards the future. So just to look at the big picture here, I think about the Convention of the Rights of the Child, because one thing that has been very important in Jim's work always has been an interest in children. And that concern for the child in classrooms and in schools has been instrumental in his work. So just to remind us, what is the Convention of the Rights of the Child? The right to an identity, the right to find out things and share what you think with others by talking, drawing, writing, or in any other way, unless it harms or offends other people. And very importantly, you have the right to practice your own culture, language, and religion. Minority and indigenous groups need special protection of this right. I mean, Jim could have written the Convention of the Rights of the Child. But if we look then at some of the reports on where children are at currently in the international community, the image is actually quite disturbing. If we just have a look at this information came out of the Education for All Global Monitoring Report. It's just been published, in fact, a month or two ago. And the basic finding, many children in the poorest countries are not learning the basics. And I want to just show you, if you see this pencil here, what we see, this represents North America, and this represents Sub-Saharan Africa. So what this represents here is that how many children by grade 4 are in school and learning. So that's what the colorful pencil represents. And then you've got this little pencil mark where children are still in school but learning very little, and then those who have not who are not in school. So here we find in North America, 96% of children in North America stay in school till grade 4 and achieve minimum reading standards. Whereas 40% of children in Sub-Saharan Africa stay in school till grade 4 and achieve minimum reading standards. So that is clearly very distressing. You'll see that children do in fact stay in school, but up to maybe 60%, but many are in fact learning very little. And Margaret earlier and I have spent a good deal of time in African communities, and we can share with you often exactly why that may be the case. So let's just look here at a few more statistics here. 1/4 of those aged 15 to 24 in poor countries are unable to read a single sentence. And there are other very disturbing features in schools that relate to questions of gender as well, health and so forth. So what does mother tongue literacy have to do with it? Well, in a UNICEF report in 1995 noted there's ample research showing that students are quicker to learn to read and acquire other academic skills when first taught in the mother tongue. They also learn a second language more quickly than those initially taught to read in an unfamiliar language. Well, of course, Jim's work has been absolutely central in this particular finding and is central then in the future of literacy in Africa. So what has he taught us about mother tongue development? This is a summary version, but he has many books, of course, that you can access to learn more of these ideas. But fundamentally, bilingualism has positive effects on children's linguistic and educational development. Mother tongue promotion in the school helps develop not only the mother tongue, but also children's abilities in the majority school language. And this is a very important point that parents don't fully appreciate, I'm sure not only in the African context, but in many contexts in other parts of the world. Clearly, children's mother tongues are fragile and easily lost in the early years of school. And very importantly, to reject a child's language in the school is to reject the child. So these are central ideas in Jim's work. And if you look at the model that we all those of you who have been through OISE are very familiar with Jim's model, but the common underlying proficiency model is central to these ideas, that although languages have different surface features, the L1 and the L2 have different surface features, there is language interdependence. And as teachers and as parents and as scholars, we need to move away from the two solitudes model and think about how we can better harness the common underlying proficiency of our students. The notion of literacy engagement is one that Jim has been talking about increasingly in more recent years, and this has been very important to the work that I've been doing in Africa. And the central point here is that reading and vocabulary acquisition improve when learners have abundant access to printed texts and also active engagement with these texts. So access to texts and engagement with these texts. So this has been very important in the African Storybook Project that I'm working on, and I'm actually working with an organization called SAIDI. It's the South African Institute for Distance Education. And here we have a picture here. This is Tessa Welch, who is the project director, and I'm actually the research advisor on that project. And if what you'll see here is another note here, inspired by Jim, who talks always about collaborative relations of power. Many of us in our work are interested in the ways in which power operates in the largest social world. And what Jim reminds us is that power does not always have to be coercive, but rather that we can work collaboratively together to make a difference in the world and to draw on those power relations for the good rather than in coercive contexts. So what I'd like to do is share with you, I'm just going to play a very short, there is a YouTube video on this, a number of them, in fact, on the African Storybook Project. But I'm going to just play probably about 2 minutes video on the African Storybook Project that you can get a sense of who stakeholders are. And I think you will already see in that video where Jim's work it has become pivotal.
In a nutshell, what we're trying to do in the African Storybook is to say, how can we ensure that there are many wonderful stories for parents to read to children, for children to read in libraries, for librarians to read to children, to teachers to work with children, and how can we make sure that there are enough of those in local languages?
The African Storybook Project is about promoting literacy for African children, predominantly in the mother tongue. And the best way that kids can learn a language, become literate, is through the mother tongue.
It's mainly about access, because access is not only going to be confined into a classroom, it's also going to be at home. They can access the stories from home. So even if they are not being taught at school their home languages, they can access them from home through, you know, our website, and learning in their own pace at their own time the stories that they've heard from their parents or from their great-grandparents.
The challenge is availability of materials to promote reading in schools in the local languages. So this project, the African Storybook Project, will greatly help to address that challenge.
So if one can provide a way in which authors can take a story that's in one language, translate it, version it into another context and another language, you immediately are creating a large number of stories for kids that they can identify with.
From one story, you seed potentially in 3 pilot countries, another 12 in South Africa, another 50 in Uganda, another 60 in Kenya.
The way that the Storybook Project began really was when Dorcas Wepakulu from Turkana, Kenya, came to Boston and began to really push me on how we were going to get materials for her students who had nothing to read.
Okay, to just give you a little bit of a sense of the stakeholders and their remarkable women, many of whom are women, who have been involved in this project. So we're looking at the creation and encouragement of openly licensed stories for the first few years of reading in digital formats on an interactive website. So what students will do, or learners will do, is to upload, translate and share versions of stories in local languages. So you can download and upload stories and share those stories more broadly. It provides African children with sufficient familiar language stories for enjoyable reading practice, and it creates a firm base for literacy development in the mother tongue and the official language. So we're working with stories in the local languages, but also in English, so that people can always translate from the English version into other languages. So we're working in different parts of Africa at the moment, in Uganda, Kenya, and South Africa. But we are really spreading wider, much further beyond that, into other African countries as well. And just to note here that even in those 3 countries, we actually have a total of already over 100 languages. So you can see this is a remarkable project. And but all examinations are in English. So while children have to or want to learn in the local language, they also need to be able to transition to English as well. At UBC, many of us have been active in not only the African Storybook Project, but in other projects in Africa for the last over 10 years. So you'll see Maureen Kendrick, you'll see Margaret Early, and of course we have had remarkable students over the years. Julia Tembe was in fact is in fact the in-country coordinator of the African Storybook Project. And Espen Stranger Johansson is working with me at present. So here we have, there's Espen, he's actually from Norway. I know we have another wonderful Norwegian speaking later today, and looking appropriately informal as a grad student. Marlene Aslan is also working with me on this project, and many others. We did have, just in October last year, we had a conference at the Stellenbosch Institute for Advanced Studies, because I'm currently a distinguished scholar at the Peter Wall Institute for Advanced Studies at UBC, and we brought together scholars and practitioners from different parts of Africa, as well as the international community. There we have Julia Tembe, there's George Openjuru, Maston Prinsloo. You may be familiar with some of these colleagues. It was a wonderful meeting, and we set up the African Storybook Research Network that I'm working with at present. So we are looking here quite innovatively at digital stories in low resource contexts. So you might say, how are we going to use the digital in contexts when we have low bandwidth. And so we're experimenting with all kinds of devices, using the cell phone, which is ubiquitous in many parts of Africa, solar power, battery power, using projectors in classrooms that can be adapted from cell phones. So it really draws on the ingenuity of people, a wide range of stakeholders in engineering and technology and education and literacy. And we're bringing together stories. We get many stories, published stories and donated stories from members of the community and also from people in the international community. We already have 120 base stories, and we've been able to then version and translate into 649 in Uganda, Kenya, and South Africa. And we continue then to develop interesting base stories and then move from those into many other stories in different languages. And we certainly have partners in different parts of the world, and India being one of those major partners. Where does BICS and KELP come in? Well, interestingly enough here, for many students, as I indicated, they do need to be able to pass examinations in English, otherwise they can't progress. And many students are very good at BICS, their oral skills are very, very good. But in the end, they do need KELP. They do need KELP in order to succeed in their communities. So what we have to do is move from context-embedded language skills to context-reduced and cognitively demanding literacy work. And in fact, what we're doing in this project is working, in a sense, in this quadrant, where we're providing context-embedded stories that will slowly but surely develop more cognitively demanding literacy materials for students. So that, for example, here we have context-embedded stories with the help of images to help kids. So, for example, we've got a story, Nozibeli and the Three Hares. Beautiful stories, these. A long time ago, 3 girls went out to collect wood. Then instead of actually having, extended text, when they had collected enough wood, they tied it into bundles and put it on their heads. What one does is just put the image, of the wood on the young girls' heads. And this is how we scaffold learning for these students. We use dual language text, and I know Rahat Nakvi is going to be talking about dual language texts as well at this conference, and those obviously are very important in our study. But I'm also, of course, interested in research, and as many of you know, I'm very interested in issues of identity. And so wherever I travel, I ask the question, how can ideas around identity inform the work that I am doing in the African context? So the questions that I'm asking myself are, how is learner and teacher identity implicated in the writing, reading, and sharing of digital stories? And what and whose investments are at stake in schools, homes, and communities? So that, for example, we've already found with older children, you can put a digital projector in a young girl's hands and you change her identity. You shift her identity from being a young student to being a photographer or a journalist, and that already puts her in a different position of power in her community. And, she can go into a police commissioner's office and take photographs that she would never do unless she had that digital projector in her hand. So we already see with older children how the digital can shift their identities in their communities. And what's intriguing to see is what happens with these younger children. So I have talked then about investment and as a complementary construct to motivation, whereas while motivation is a predominantly psychological construct, investment is predominantly sociological. There has already been some development. The work of Zoltan Donia has taken up issues of the self in motivation research, and that's very exciting, because the work that I have done in investment assumes that learners have complex identities, changing across time and space and reproduced in social interaction. We see people as being social beings rather than, in a sense, individuals. And so the questions that I'm asking, not only are students motivated to read digital stories, are teachers motivated to teach digital stories? The questions are students and teachers invested in digital stories and digital literacy practices? So the question is, what are their identities as they engage with these digital practices? And we're interested not only in student identity, but also in teacher identity. And to what extent are digital texts as digital stories, in fact, what Cummins and early call identity texts? So we get then to some other ideas of Jim's that have been very central to these projects. And Jim and Margaret talk about cognitive engagement and identity investment in their work. Identity texts refer to artifacts that students produce. Students take ownership of these artifacts as a result of having invested their identities in them. And once produced, these texts, whether written, spoken, visual, musical, hold a mirror up to the student in which his or her identity is reflected back in a positive light. Now, interestingly enough, in the African context, and certainly the work that we're doing, what we see here is texts that are produced not only by students, but by the community, by students and parents and grandparents. So what's very interesting is here we're moving from texts that are produced by students, but to texts that are produced by communal authors. And certainly what we see is very positive images here in many of these stories. As a matter of interest, this particular story was donated by Alexander McCall Smith. You might know his work from the Ladies Detective Agency series. So interesting, all the people who are joining us in this wonderful project. At the same time, though, there are troubling images. This is the story of the girl with one breast. The man sped home, picked up a knife, pounced on his wife, and the breast was off instantly. So what you see here are texts that are moving from the oral domain to the written domain, and what people were able to navigate with relative ease in the oral domain becomes more problematic in the literate domain. And so these are not necessarily positive images that are reflected back. And how do we manage that, in this particular project? And then we think, well, if we think of Jim's work on collaborative relations of power, well, how do we work collaboratively with communities? Who decides what is an appropriate story? What is a meaningful story for students? So here we have with Nozibele and the Three Hares, when the dog said, "Sleep with me." "I've never slept with a dog before," said Nozibele. "Sleep with me or I'll bite you," said the dog. So Nozibele slept with the dog. Is this appropriate? And who decides? So how do we navigate power in this context? What about ownership and open access? What we've done, we're working with Creative Commons, because what we want, very importantly, we want to be sure that in fact not only are the writers of stories acknowledged, but also the illustrators who are very important in story development. And Creative Commons provides us with a mechanism to acknowledge the writers and illustrators. We also have, though, Lost in Translation, and I'd be interested in Rahat when she deals with her bilingual stories. You have a lovely story like about I dance when I'm happy, I dance when I'm sad, I dance when I'm lonely, I dance when I'm mad. That's really wonderful jingle. And then it gets translated into Lusoga, which is the Ugandan language. But when you look at the exact translation of that Lusoga tale, it becomes, dancing is very good, dancing is so amusing, it amuses so many people, even when someone is annoyed. So you see we're losing some of the rhythm and some of the beauty of the original. And these are some of the challenges that we're experiencing. But we're looking here at what Jim has also been very interested in, of course, is language, power and pedagogy. and what does that actually mean in the classroom. So the project that we're going to be doing, that in fact I'm working with Espen Stranger Johansson, is what is actually happening in the classroom with students, because what is happening on the ground is absolutely central to this project. No matter how many interesting papers get written and how much wonderful discourse analysis gets done, unless these stories are taken up by children in classrooms and in libraries, we will not have been successful in this project. So the question is, how do we support teachers, parents and communities to use digital stories effectively? And how do we mediate digital stories with children? So what we're going to be doing is working in northern Uganda in 3 schools and 2 libraries to actually see how teachers navigate these texts. So when we think about the future, we think about education for all. And this is yet another global movement which has a target of 2015. And what we see in this particular image here is that the international community set certain goals for education for all for 2015. But we see here in the green images here are countries where the targets have been achieved for pre-primary education, primary education, lower secondary education, adult literacy. But we see that in fact there is still a great deal of work to be done, that many countries are in fact very far from these target goals. Gender parity it remains a challenge in many parts of the world. Lower secondary education gender parity is something that we are all struggling with. So as we move towards the future, we're going to take with us notions of the independence hypothesis, literacy engagement, power as collaborative, Biggs and Kelp, and identity texts. And I know, Jim, that you're going to be with us on this journey. So thank you very much.